Hi, welcome back. You're tuned to Botany 101 and my name is Angela Nishimoto. Okay, so today, plant diversity. We're going to do a survey of different organisms. Okay, so our objectives. We're going to go over a couple of different classification schemes. Secondly, we're going to go over these different kinds of plants and plant-like organisms, organisms that were once classified as plants. Thirdly, we're going to talk a little bit about how these different kinds of plants and plant-like organisms impact us humans. Okay? First of all, we go all the way back to the father of taxonomy, Carolus Linnaeus, yes? So he proposed a three-kingdom system, the familiar, okay, two of them, animal and vegetable. And of course, he also talked about minerals. He classified animals and vegetables or plants, right? So here we have a bunch of animals. We have mammals, yeah, and these lions. We have these orcas. I believe they're also mammals. Okay, these are killer whales. We have the jellies. We have birds. Okay, and we also have these tortoise here. So all these over on this side, except for the jellies, these are all different kinds of vertebrates or animals with backbones. Yeah. So usually when we're thinking about animals, we think about those kinds of animals. But there are lots and lots of different kind of animals that people call invertebrates. That's sort of like an artificial classification because the invertebrates, you know, including the jellies, including mollusks, a lot of different kinds of animals, they actually make up the bulk of different kinds of creatures in the animal kingdom. All right? And of course, vegetables. Okay, according to Linnaeus, include the plants, and you can see that these are plants. How can you tell? Because they're green. Okay, they do photosynthesis. They're what we call autotrophs. They make their own food. Okay, so here's some products of flowering plants, including vegetables. Okay, these carrots, and we have fruits, apples and oranges. We have modified stems, such as these potatoes. We have flowers like these artichokes. Okay. And here we have flower buds, okay, cauliflower, and etc. Okay, so these, of course, are in the plant kingdom or classified as vegetable, according to Linnaeus. Okay. Now, so over time, from the 1700s to the 1800s into the 1900s, different people kind of debated about the different ways of classifying living things. So a scientist named Robert Whittaker, in the 1970s, decided, and he proposed a five-kingdom system. Okay, so there are various classification schemes between Linnaeus and Whittaker, of course, but this is one that people followed for quite a while too. And in this classification, you had one kingdom called Monera that included all different kind of organisms that were called prokaryotes. We're going to get into that in just a minute. Okay. Furthermore, he classified different kinds of organisms that had eukaryotic cells, okay, in five kingdoms, including the Protista, okay, including mostly single-celled organisms. We're going to get into that in a little bit. And we have the Animalia, or the animals, the fungi, okay, and the plants. So according to Whittaker's classification scheme, there would be five kingdoms of different kinds of organisms. Okay, so the kingdom Monera encompassed, okay, mostly bacteria, all right? And so what you had is you had usually single-celled organisms, okay, called prokaryotes, all right? And they were mostly single-celled. Some of these organisms also live colonially, but when you look at the cell, okay, you'll see that, you know, of course, a cell has components of the cell. You have a cell membrane surrounding the insides and kind of partitioning it away from the environment. Then you had genetic material in the form of a circular chromosome. Okay, with the chromosome being in direct contact with the cytoplasm. So those are the three components of any cell. You have a cell membrane, you have genetic material, and you have the cytoplasm. Okay, so that pretty much is what bacterial cells are like. Okay, mostly kind of simple. This particular bacterial cell also has a flagellum, okay, that helps propel it through any kind of liquid medium that it happens to find itself in. And these organisms are mostly unicellular. Okay, some of them are colonial. All right. The kingdom Protista, okay, include things like this, Paramecium. Okay, this is a single-celled organism, all right, and you have different kinds of living things in this kingdom that are animal-like, Okay, they're like animals, but they're not quite in the animal kingdom. You had fungus-like organisms that are like fungi, but not quite fungi. You also have plant-like organisms too. Okay. Another thing about the members of this kingdom is that they could be unicellular, as in this paramecium. Secondly, you might also have some multicellular organisms that are simple multicellular organisms. So the kingdom Protista is sort of like a catch-all kingdom. People actually put organisms that seem, you know, that don't actually fit other classifications. So it's sort of like a catch-all. It's sort of like a dustbin in a way. People say sort of unkindly, a dustbin of organisms. Okay. Kingdom Animalia. Okay, so the other three kingdoms are generally, the organisms are classified as to their nutritional modes. Animals are ingestive heterotrophs. What does that mean? First of all, so let's take a look at these terms here. Okay, heterotrophs, okay, are organisms that get their energy needs met, okay, by getting a source of energy outside of themselves. Okay, ingestive in the case of animals means that these different kind of organisms eat their food just like us. They have just like us, and we're in the kingdom Animalia as well, according to this classification scheme. They need to actually eat their food or get their food from the environment, taking it in, and then digesting it, moving it through oftentimes the digestive tract. So here, okay, is showing a whole bunch of different kinds of animals. Here you have a sponge, it looks like. Okay, and you have corals as well. Okay, and this photograph, this image is a reminder to us that many animals, a lot of different kind of animals, are actually what we call invertebrates. Okay, corals and sponges don't have backbones, or they're not chordates. But we tend to see mostly animals with backbones just because we happen to be animals with backbones, so we definitely have a bias. Okay. You also have, so here's an animal with a backbone. Hard to remember that penguins are actually birds. Okay, they're aves in a group called the aves. Okay, or birds. So here we also have another kind of invertebrate, and this is an insect, of course, also known as arthropods. Okay, arthropods meaning jointed legs or jointed feet, and this damselfly is in the group the insects. Yeah, so this is another kind of animal. Okay. We also have something like this. This looks like aquatic flatworm, right? So this one looks like it lives in a marine environment as well. So you have a whole group of different kinds of animals that belong to this kind of group, the flatworms, the platyhelminthes. Okay. And here you have a mollusk. This, of course, is a he'e. Some people call it a he'e, also known as an octopus. Okay, some people call it squid here locally. It's a little bit different, but squids and octopuses are in the group Mollusca. Okay, they're related to things like PPP, also known as nephrites, I guess how you say it. And you also have the Opihi, all right, which is a kind of limpet, all right. So locally, of course, we like to eat a lot of members of this group, yeah, the mollusks. Okay. And we also have another kind of animal with backbones, and this is an amphibian, okay? And of course, you can see it's a frog, kind of like a nice fat frog, you know? It's kind of attractive animal, yeah, very striking. And here it is, you know, whether it's male or female, kind of crouching or sitting here on this branch. So it has these 4 legs, okay? So it is actually an animal with backbones, okay? Amphibians too means like amphi means both, and bien is like bio, so it leads a double life. This kind of animal has its life cycle partly in the terrestrial environment, okay, and also partly in the marine, not marine environment, but freshwater environment. So this kind of animal spends part of its life in the water and part of its life on land. Okay, so amphibian, okay, leading a double life. We also have another kingdom called the kingdom fungi, okay. And these kinds of organisms are also heterotrophs, but so they get their nutritional needs met through outside of themselves, but they absorb their nutrients. So what these fungi do, they'll actually secrete digestive enzymes and then absorb it, okay, into its body. So for kingdom fungi are absorptive heterotrophs, okay. Of course, the last of the 5 kingdoms that we're going to talk about here in this little section is that the kingdom Plantae. And the plant kingdom encompasses organisms that are autotrophs. What does auto mean? Auto means self or by itself. Just like automobile means like you actually are able to move around by yourself. So trophic kind of refers to how it gets its nutrition. So these plants, as we know from photosynthesis and etc., okay, get their nutritional needs met by making their own food using sunlight energy. They're also the basis of the food chain, right? All right, then furthermore, we come to the three-domain system that was kind of instituted or proposed in the 1990s, right? And this is one that thinks of a classification system that is at a higher level, okay, in terms of the domain system, okay? So first of all, you have the domain bacteria, okay? Second of all, you have the domain archaea. Thirdly, you have the domain eukarya. All right, so in this classification scheme, you have a little bit of a moving around of different kind of organisms, all right? Okay, so the domain eukarya encompasses kingdoms called Protista, the kingdom Animalia, all right? Then we also have the kingdom Fungi, all right? So this is, and also the kingdom Plantae, almost forgot that, the most important one, right? Okay, so in this three-domain system, okay, we have a scientist named Woese who proposed this, all right? So you have prokaryotes, including the bacteria and the archaeans, okay, that are making up two different domains. The third domain are the eukarya that include all other living life forms. And this has to do with the cellular structure, with the bacteria and the archaeans being prokaryotes, right? So when you think about the word prokaryote, pro means before, and karyote refers to karyon, which means kernel, okay? So members of the bacteria and the archaea are different kinds of organisms that don't have true nuclei. So we'll get into that in a little bit. The eukarya do have true nuclei, okay? So the domain bacteria include the prokaryotes, and here you have, let's see, you have Escherichia coli, okay, which is a coliform bacteria. They live in our gut, all right? So the prokaryotes, okay, include this type, and these, of course, do not have membrane-bound nuclei, right? So prokaryote, before a nucleus. So different kind of prokaryotes, you know, which are in the bacteria, domain bacteria, don't have membrane-bound nuclei. They also do not have membrane-bound organelles. They also do have all different kinds of nutritional modes. That means that in the domain bacteria, you have organisms that get their energy source, okay, from the environment, from sunlight. So you have some that do photosynthesis, okay, or are autotrophic. They also have autotrophs that have their carbon source being from inorganic carbon or carbon dioxide. You also have those that are autotrophs that make their own food using sunlight energy, but their source of carbon are organic sources, such as other kinds of organisms, all right? You also have some of these bacteria being heterotrophic. They'll actually get their energy source from other organisms, but they get their carbon from gases, carbon dioxide, right? Inorganic carbon. And then you also have those that get their nutritional needs met by taking in nutrients from other, energy from other organisms. Then they also have that they have their nutritional needs, their carbon source being organic matter, okay, or from living things or dead things, all right? So you have a whole different bunch of different kinds of nutritional modes. Another kind of organism that are in the domain bacteria are those that do photosynthesis, like we just talked about, include the cyanobacteria. So the cyanobacteria are also known as, let's see, as blue-green bacteria. They're also known as blue-green algae. So these groups, so we're talking about this too because these kind of prokaryotes, okay, bacteria were actually traditionally studied by botanists. Okay, this is one of the reasons why we're going into them in a little bit in depth, okay? The domain archaea, here's a really kind of interesting, violently colored sort of image here. This is a photograph taken of a hot springs area, yeah? So what you see here, of course, is steam because you have these hot waters kind of bubbling up from inside that have been warmed up by I guess, volcanism in one way. And so you have these hot springs. So very beautiful, yeah, this image. So here you have different kinds of archaeans that live in what some might call to be inhospitable environments, okay, very hot areas, so you might call them thermophiles, okay, hyperthermophiles that like very hot environments. And when you think of hot springs, think about maybe going to one on your vacation. You know, when you take vacation, go to some place, maybe like in New Mexico or in Colorado. I had a friend who went to Colorado in the wintertime, and he talked about interesting time kind of swimming in these hot springs with snow all around him, you know. So that sounds like a wonderful way to relax. For one thing, the hot springs, of course, because the water is relatively hot, helps relax your muscles. And a lot of these hot springs too, you have some that have a little bit of, what do you call that? Some kind of substances such as sulfur, high sulfur springs, and other things like that that have arsenic in it. So of course you wouldn't want to internally take arsenic because it is a poison, it's a toxin, but you can actually get some benefits from lying in hot springs that have water that are sort of, you know, permeated with arsenic. It's supposed to help with things like arthritis and things like that. So you could go to Santa Fe is one place where you could do that. Anyway, so there sounds like a very pleasurable sort of activity that's also healthful as well. Okay, so these members of the domain Archaea are prokaryotes. Okay, so one of the things you saw was the hot springs. They also live in places very salty, like the Dead Sea that you see here on the right, and then you also have the Great Salt Lake. This is a photograph of the Great Salt Lake at one point when they were undergoing a drought. So you see that the lake itself has sort of drawn back. Okay, very hot environments, sometimes very salty environments they can live in. Okay, so they're sometimes referred to as extremophiles, just because they can live in some places where other organisms can't live at all. It's too hot, okay, or too salty, or too acid, or too basic, okay, for other kinds of organisms to live in. Okay, now the third domain is a domain eukarya. Okay, and these encompass organisms that have eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are cells, you know, eu means true or good. In this case, it refers to true nuclei. Remember, karyon refers to a nucleus. So the prokaryotes were different kind of organisms that do not have true nuclei, where eukaryotes do have membrane-bound nuclei. Okay? Another feature that eukaryotes have too is they also have organelles as well. Remember way back when we were talking about the cell? So here's an image, a drawing of a plant cell, okay? And of course, this might be a little bit of a refresher here. You have a membrane-bound nucleus, okay, as well as organelles, all right? So you have things like the central vacuole, you have the chloroplast, you have mitochondria, okay, you have the membranous organelles inside of the cell, including the ER, the endoplasmic reticulum, whether it's rough ER or smooth ER. You also have the Golgi apparatus, or the Golgi body, also known as a dictyosome, okay? Also, the cell, of course, is surrounded by the cell membrane. In this case, this plant cell, it's here in yellow, the cell membrane, and outside of that, you have the cell walls, okay? So this is a little bit of a refresher for you folks in terms of the plant cell. So from the outside cell wall, we have the cell membrane, you have the cytoplasm, or the liquid inside of the cell, in which you have the organelle suspended, okay, and also supported from the outside by the cell wall, supported by the inside from the turgor, or the water-filled vacuole, providing internal support, as well as something called the cytoskeleton, which is made up of what? Microfilaments, intermediate filaments, also microtubules. All right, and then so you have the nucleus, in which you have the chromatin. Remember the diffuse chromatin in the nucleus that stays in the nucleus. And before cell division, before mitosis or even meiosis, you have the chromosomes kind of condensing right from the chromatin. See, this is all stuff that we covered before, okay? And of course, so you have organelles inside the plant cell, okay, and this allows for division of labor, with the nucleus, of course, having the genetic information, the rough ER providing proteins for the cell, the smooth ER providing lipids and other kind of chemicals for export out of the cell, chloroplast where you have photosynthesis happening, mitochondria where most of aerobic cellular respiration happens, okay? And you have the vacuole, okay, that stores things as well as provides for internal support of the cell. So all the different kind of organelles, their structure, okay, and their function are, you know, intimately kind of integrated with each other. The structure kind of determines, or the function actually determines the structure. Okay, so all of these optimally perform the jobs that they need to do, you know, depending on what they are, what they do. So it provides for a division of labor inside of a cell. So an animal cell, very similar to plant cells too. Certain things that are different. Of course, animal cells do not have, and neither do fungal cells, they don't have chloroplasts because they don't do photosynthesis. Remember, they're heterotrophs, so they actually get their nutritional needs met by taking in molecules and some such from other organisms from outside of their environments. Animals need to eat, right? Fungi need to absorb their nutrients. Okay. All right, so eukaryotes have membrane-bound nuclei. They also have organelles. Animal cells, fungal cells, plant cells being mostly similar. Okay, so what does that tell you? Think about it. When you think about it, all eukaryotes, all right, all eukaryotes are actually related to each other. Okay, so one of the things is that fungi have been traditionally studied by botanists. Remember, what is a field where you study fungi? It's called mycology, right? Mycology. So fungi traditionally studied by botanists, but fungi are actually more closely related to animals, to us, than they are to plants, interestingly enough. Okay? Alrighty, so we also have in the eukarya, you have the 4 different kingdoms, okay, including the kingdom Protista. Remember that the Protista are sort of like the taxon that holds different kind of organisms that don't fit in the other kingdom, right? Okay? Okay, so protists actually could be unicellular or they can be multicellular, all right? So here we have a photograph of something called Giardia. You had to look that up to kind of see. And this is a unicellular protist. This is actually one that is a parasite inside of humans. It can make you sick. Giardia, you know, you sometimes hear about people drinking water that hasn't been properly treated, and they can get symptoms, like cold symptoms. You get fevers and chills, all kinds of nasty stuff, including, you know, running stomach or diarrhea. Okay, so this is a little organism that makes its living, pretty much lives its life by infecting host organisms, yeah? And then part of the cycle is that it does actually need to get its nutrients from a host. Okay, unicellular sort of organism. Okay, so you have animal-like organisms, fungal-like organisms, and plant-like organisms. And here, this is some kind of dead. Looks like a dead insect, a dead water insect of some kind, maybe a nymph of a dragonfly, but this is dead. And here you have all this kind of substance around it. This is actually probably a fungal-like organisms. I think it's what they call an oomycete. Okay, what it is actually feeding on the and helping to decay the body of this poor unfortunate insect here. Okay, so here you have a fungal-like sort of protist. Okay, and sometimes you have plant-like protists too. Now here, this I believe is a slime mold. Okay, so this is probably in one stage of its life form. So in slime modes, you have cellular slime modes and you have plasmodial slime modes. All right, so they're very interesting. They're very weird kind of organisms that they can. The cellular slime mode actually spends part of its life cycle in an amoeba-like state, where they kind of crawl around and they kind of, you know, move by means of these feet. You know, these pseudopods, and what they'll do is they'll actually take in different kind of nutrients as, you know, separate individual organisms. But when the environment is is detrimental to them, they'll actually aggregate and they'll actually form a multicellular thing that looks like a little slug or something like that. But they're colonial in that phase too. They're really, really interesting, these different kinds of protists. So very different from each other. Okay. Another group that the Protista encompasses include the algae as well. Okay, so algae are another kind of group. They're plant-like, okay, but at the same time, they're not really quite plants. Okay, now the algae are classified according to the pigments that are present in their body, because the algae do photosynthesis. You might recall that earlier in the class we talked about photosynthesis, and then you have the cyanobacteria, and then you have algae, and you have the green plants that can do photosynthesis. Now the algae, one of the ways they classify the algae, they're classified according to what kind of pigments that they happen to have, especially the macroalgae. Okay? So if you have macroalgae, you also have microalgae. Microalgae are algae that you can only see with a microscope usually. Okay, they're usually unicellular, all right? And the microalgae include, okay, members of the division Pyrophyta or Pyrophyta, okay? So this group here, okay, they're also known as a dinoflagellates, okay? You can call them dinoflagellates because they're body form. They have two flagella, one of them going around the middle of the body, so they do look a little bit different from each other, but all the dinoflagellates have the same structure. You have one flagella that goes around its center section. You'll have another flagellum in a groove that runs up and down, and that kind of floats free, and that kind of helps them propel themselves through their environments, okay? So they are considered to be algae of a sort. Some people think that they belong in another group instead, but generally, classically, people consider dinoflagellates to be part of the microalgae flora, okay? So dinoflagellates and how they affect us, okay? They actually are responsible for what we call red tide, okay? So what is red tide? It's actually when the water is colored this way because you've got billions and billions and billions of these single-celled algae, and they're all kind of, you have an algal bloom. Okay, sometimes it is actually touched off by having a lot of fertilizers or other sorts of chemicals that are runoff, and what that can cause is that the algae to reproduce themselves really quickly, and they have pigments that make the water look red, brownish red, like here, okay? So red tides, and oftentimes red tides are also, so as you can see that some people think maybe that even the parting of the Red Sea, you know, might have had to do with an algal bloom too. Not the parting of the Red Sea, but that the Red Sea was red at the time, or at times, because of algal blooms. Okay, I might be conflating different things here. But here too, you can see that you see two phenomena here, okay? One of which is a red tide. You have a whole bunch, you know, billions and billions, billions, you know, of these organisms all making the water a reddish brown color, but you also have some of them, you know, fluorescing in a way called bioluminescence. So sometimes if you go to Waikiki, okay, if you go to Waikiki or you go to other areas, you know, where you have the seawater coming in, sometimes what happens is you do see this bioluminescence. You have like the foaming waves, it's all kind of glowing in the dark. Okay, so if you go to like Kaimana Beach, which is by the New Botany Hotel, I think that's what they call it now, okay, you actually can see, you know, it's kind of dark, you have lights because they have the Halatree Lanai there, I guess, which is a nice place to have drinks, yeah? And so what you have is you have the water, you know, washing in, the waves coming in. You can see that there's kind of glowing in the dark. That's a phenomenon known as bioluminescence. Okay, it's kind of interesting, very beautiful to see. Another thing that these dinoflagellates can do is that this here is a chemical structure of a toxin, okay? Dinoflagellates can also have toxins building up. They produce these toxins, and when you have mollusks, you know, such as shellfishes, such as mussels or oysters or other sorts of different kinds of shellfish, they'll actually, you know, they have their food apparatuses, because of course mollusks are actually carnivores. They'll actually eat things, and what or they're herbivores. What they'll do is, since they're heterotrophs, is they will eat their food, and when they eat their food, they actually have these toxins building up that are produced by these pyrophytes. Okay, you have these toxins building up in the tissues of these mollusks, and what can happen? You can have paralytic shellfish poisoning. That's one thing that can happen to people if they're eating different kinds of seafoods, okay, because these different kinds of seafoods will actually have eaten, you know, these dinoflagellates. So you can have these things building up in these different kinds of shellfish. You can also have something called ciguatera happening too. That comes as a result from the fish, you know, eating fish that eats, you know, these dinoflagellates, and you have a buildup of the toxins in their body, and you can get ciguatera poisoning too, due to the dinoflagellates that produce these toxins. Okay. Another kind of microalga, okay, is called in the division the chrysophytes or the chrysophyta. Right? And the one that we're going to talk about are the diatoms. When you look at them, aren't they beautiful? I think we talked about them a little earlier in the class too. They're beautiful this way because they're cell walls, okay, because these do have cell walls. Their cell walls are made of silica. Okay, they're so beautiful because the cell walls look like cut glass or cut crystal. So you can see these, I guess they call them pinnate diatoms and such. Okay, very, very beautiful. Okay. And so diatoms also have uses for us too. So here's another image. I think this is one that is from maybe the last century or the century before, or even the century before that. This is an illustration. And you can see how complex the cell walls of these diatoms can be. Just beautiful. They're like cut crystal, cut glass. Okay? Diatoms have been used by us. Let's see, one of the things they're used, since they're single-celled, of course you can't see them with the unaided eye, but what you can do is you can look at them under the microscope, and they do have uses now. One of the uses that they use with diatoms, you know, the remains of diatoms, this is like glass, yeah? So what they'll do is they'll actually have these fossilized diatoms, or these cell walls that are left, they form something that is known as diatomaceous earth. What are the things they do with that is they'll use that for filtering in chemistry. They'll use it to kind of filter things through, to kind of purify. What do they call that? You know, when you have a chemical and you're filtering it through these, they call it, let's see, it's like a filtering process where you can separate different kind of chemicals, yeah? Anyway, what do you call that? Anyway, so that can help people purify chemicals before they put it through something like a spectrophotometer, where you actually have these substances, you put it in this machine, and it'll give you absorptance spectrum that can tell you what kind of chemicals are actually making up the larger chemical. Okay, so you can do that. Okay. Anyway, so you have that. Diatoms can do that. Another use of diatomaceous earth is people are using it now, like putting it into, before they put in the foundation of their homes. Because, you know, before they used to use a really, really small gravel, yeah, for kind of keeping it termite proof. Well, they find out that these chrysophyte fossils, you can use it to make it, because what happens if the termites try to crawl through it, what happens is that these are so fine and so tiny. Remember that these are single-celled algae. So their cell walls, you can use it to kind of keep termites from actually colonizing your house, especially ground termites, which are very, very destructive. You know, what are they called? Formosan termites? Yeah, they can actually destroy your home within 2 years, even if you have a brand new house. If you don't treat it or pre-treat it, or even, you know, put this diatomaceous earth in there, you can have a termite infestation that can destroy your home within 2 years. That's true, you know. Kind of a worrisome thing. If you spend thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars for a home, of course you want to protect your investment, yeah? So make sure you termite treat your house. Okay, next we're going to talk about the macroalgae, and one of them, okay, one of the types, you know, classified according to their pigments, are in the division Chlorophyta. So remember, you have the domain, and then you have the kingdom. So we're talking about the kingdom Protista, and now we have the division Chlorophyta. Just like before, we talked about the division Chrysophyta, we talked about the division that has the dinoflagellates in. Okay, so we have the division Chlorophyta, all right? And these are the green algae. They're called the green algae because they're usually green when you look at them. Almost always they're green. Okay, that's one thing you can almost count on. Okay? So these members of the division Chlorophyta are very, very varied. You can have green algae that are unicellular, like this here. This is a photomicrograph. What kind of photomicrograph is it? Okay, think this is a unicellular green alga, and this is actually showing you surface features of this alga. So this is a scanning electron micrograph, yeah? So this here is called Chlamydomonas. Okay, it's a unicellular green alga. Usually they have a little red eye spot that helps them to sense where light is, and they'll kind of move around. They also, because they have these flagella. These flagella allow them to propel themselves through their aqueous environment that they live in. Okay, so here you have a unicellular alga, and here you have a multicellular alga, which I think is Enteromorpha. Okay. So multicellular algae, you can actually see their bodies with, you know, the unaided or naked eye. You also have some algae that are colonial. You have these single cells that actually live together. So you have unicellular algae in the green algae, you have colonial algae in this group also, and you have true multicellular organisms, okay, where you have many cells making up the thallus or the body of this alga, okay? Another very noteworthy thing about the chlorophytes is that scientists believe that the chlorophytes gave rise to the land plants, one of the more than 400 million years ago. Okay, because what happened was eventually the plants colonized the land. The algae eventually evolved into green plants. Okay, what happened then is that you had animals that ate plants or ate algae or ate land plants following their food onto the land, and then you had the carnivores. Okay, following their animal prey onto land too, all right? So where plants are, there you can find animals, because animals eat plants, okay? Or animals eat the animals that eat plants. Very important. So plants, primary producers, okay? They're primary, and they're primary because we need them. You know, we can't live without plants, okay? So remember that the plants are the producers. They can actually use sunlight energy to make food in the form of sugars, make more plant. And then animals, just like us, we eat limu, right? We eat ogo, right? So we do eat plants from the sea as well as plants on land, right? Okay, all life depends on plants. Another kind of division, okay, in the macroalgae, okay, in the Protistan, is a division Rhodophyta, and the rhodophytes are the red algae, okay. And here we have a nice image. I think I've actually seen this too. I think I remember seeing it in hard copy. This, of course, is from the internet, okay, but I've actually seen drawings like this, and I think I saw it in a phycologist's office. I think she had a bunch of drawings that showed these red algae, okay. And then, so the rhodophytes are noteworthy for us in terms of their economic importance, because these rhodophytes are kind of, a lot of them are kind of slimy, a lot of algae themselves are slimy in field, right? So they have these substances called carrageenans. Okay, carrageenans, what are they used for? If you look in the ingredients of yogurt or ice cream or cottage cheese, sometimes you'll see alginates, and that's usually from brown algae, but you also see carrageenans. They're actually used as emulsifiers. Okay, what is an emulsifier? An emulsifier, excuse me, an emulsifier is actually a substance that let fats and water or aqueous solutions, you know, like water and lipids, mix together. So you'll usually find them on containers of yogurt, containers of cheese, because not cheeses, cottage cheeses, and also ice cream, because emulsifiers will allow the fat in the ice cream, as an example, the fat in the ice cream to actually stay in solution with the water that makes up ice cream. So if you have a bunch of ice cream in the refrigerator, I mean in the freezer, I haven't eaten ice cream in a while, so I don't think about this. So ice cream is in the freezer, right? So what does it do? These carrageenans, they kind of help the fat in the ice cream, especially if you have high-fat ice cream like Haagen-Dazs or Dreyer's, you know, high-fat kind of premium ice creams, Ben & Jerry's, and then that allows the fat to stay in a solution with the water that helps make up the ice cream. Because what happens if you have ice cream in the freezer for like months and months and months, what happens? The water starts to crystallize out of them. So what you have is these emulsifiers, such as carrageenan, such as alginates, that help to keep the ice cream together. You have the fat in the ice cream from the milk products, as well as the water in there to keep them together. You also have another substance from red algae known as agar, okay, agar, A-G-A-R. What that does, people use it in medical uses and in horticulture uses, because they use that to make the media, you know, in which they will plate out and grow different organisms in tissue culture. We also saw it in another context. Can you remember what we saw agar in another context is? Do you remember? Okay. Remember the agarose gels that you use to run the DNA or the proteins on a gel? That's actually used for that, because agar is, it actually melts at 100 degrees, you know, where water boils, and it forms a solid when it's at a lower temperature. So, and another thing about it, it's inert. So what do they use it for? They use it for these biomedical and also molecular biology applications, because for one thing, it's inert. It doesn't react with anything that you put it in. That's very important in chemistry. You know, so it's very, very stable. Okay. Also, since it melts at the boiling point of water, you can just heat it up in a microwave. Put the, you know, heat water in the or not water, but you know, like a buffer, and sometimes water in a microwave. You know, then you put the agar in there, you boil it up, and you can pour a gel, and then it'll solidify. And because it is non-reactive, you can pipette different kinds of DNA samples or other kind of biological produced molecules, and it stays by itself. It doesn't actually react with the agarose gels. Anyway, that's sort of like a circular way of kind of mentioning that, okay? Okay, so the last group, so the last division is a division Phaeophyta, okay? And these include the brown algae, okay? So the phaeophytes are the brown algae, the brown macroalgae. So here, this looks like kelp, okay? And here are other, I think this is called fucus, another group of brown algae, and I think this is actually native to more temperate areas, okay? And then we also have a sargassum, okay? You know, you ever heard of the Wide Sargasso Sea? Yeah, the Sargasso Sea, which is in the Caribbean area. There's a book called The Wide Sargasso Sea by an excellent writer named Jean Rees, okay? Anyway, so you have a whole bunch of sargassums, and the sargassum in Hawaii, people call it the limu kala. Okay, you could actually eat limukala, but it's kind of hard to eat, but people also use it ceremonially, okay, in a kind of ceremony known as a ho'oponopono, yeah, which has to do with if you have in your family an argument going on and people are angry at each other or hurt, not feeling good, people will usually sit down, and then the people in the family will sit down, they'll talk about it, and then as a closing ceremony for it, they will actually eat a little piece of this limu kala, because I think it's kala also means to forgive, yeah, to untie as well, right? All right, and then anyway, so that pretty much sums up what we want to know about the kingdom protista. Next we have the kingdom fungi. Okay, the fungi, of course, remember, they're absorptive heterotrophs, so they need to get their energy requirements met by consuming, or not consuming, that actually, what it is consuming other kinds of organic matter from either living or dead things. So parasites, of course, okay, they're either parasites or the saprobes, and parasites actually get their food requirements met from feeding on a living host, whereas saprophytes or saprobes, okay, will actually help decay and take in nutrients from dead material, okay, whether it's animals, whether it's plants, whether it's protists, whether it's other fungi, okay? So the kingdom fungi, this is one of their main characteristics, okay? There's parasites or there's saprobes, and another thing too is that they're absorptive heterotrophs. They secrete digestive enzymes to the environment around them, then they'll absorb them through structures known as hyphae. Okay, hyphae. So what happens? You're in your garden, or you're working somewhere. You're digging in the soil. What happens is that you have this kind of filamentous looking white stuff. That's something the body, okay, called hyphae. So the fungi are made up of hyphae. The hyphae together forms the fungal mass or the fungal body known as a mycelium. Okay. So these are two characteristics of fungi. They're either parasites or saprobes, and they also are made of hyphae generally, okay, forming a fungal body known as a mycelium. Okay, these are actually two grouped in different divisions. So remember, domain, kingdom, division. Yeah, dear King David, come out for goodness sake, right? So you have the division, the zygomycota, also known as the zygomycetes. They're characterized by the fact that they're diploid state, okay, because for one thing, the seaweeds or the algae that we talked about, the macroalgae we talked about, and the fungi, they too go through an alternation of generation. And during their, the zygomycetes or the zygomycota, they have a phase in their life cycle where they form these thick-walled spores known as zygospores. Okay, that's their diploid state. Right after they form these zygospores, after fertilization, then what you have inside going on in the spores, you'll have meiosis going on in the spores to produce zygospores, which are haploid. Okay, so you have these thick-walled spores as the only diploid state in the zygomycetes, and then right away they'll have meiosis going on in them, forming the spores that are called zygospores. Okay, a good example of this is called the bread molds. All right, so here he's showing a bunch of bread slices. I know it's kind of gross looking, yeah, but still, fungi have to live too. And what they're doing, they're actually taking this bread, of course, what is it made from? What is bread made from? It's made from wheat, okay, and other kind of grains, and of course wheat and other grains are grain-bearing plants are grasses, and grasses are plants. So here you have a zygomycete living off and reproducing like crazy on this dead plant material, okay? And of course bread also has eggs, which is, usually has eggs in it too, which is from animal sources, yes? Okay, another division are called the ascomycota. Okay, and here we have a whole bunch of petri dishes with agar in it, okay, agar, which they have plated out and allowed these colonies of ascomycetes to be growing, okay? So the ascomycota are characterized by the fact that they produce their spores in a structure known as an ascus. I think this is showing germinating spores, and this might be an ascus or part of an ascus. This is actually forming these filamentous sort of structures, I think, known as hyphae. Okay. Another thing is that the ascomycetes include yeasts, okay, and here you see some unicellular yeasts. And yeasts, of course, are unicellular fungi that usually reproduce through budding. So you'll have like a larger yeast fungus, having a little bit of it kind of ballooning out over the side, producing another yeast fungus or individual. Okay, so they usually reproduce asexually, the yeasts do anyway. Other kinds of ascomycetes includes the morels and the truffles. This is a real truffle. The real truffle, I don't have an image of it here, but the truffle, it's like a fungus. Okay, it's a beautiful fruiting body. It's supposed to smell really good. I've never eaten truffles, at least not knowingly, but morels and truffles are definitely edible fungal bodies. Okay, this isn't like the chocolate truffles. That's something different. But true truffle, I guess they call the chocolate truffles truffles because these truffles that are fungal truffles are really, really, really expensive. They're like hundreds of, or maybe thousands of dollars per pound. Okay, so truffles. Okay, they used to use pigs to find truffles, like in France, but the pigs are fond of them too. So what the pigs will do, they'll actually sniff out, find the truffles growing, and then they'll dig them up and they'll eat them. Okay, so what people use now to find truffles, they'll use dogs to find them now too, because the truffles, the actual bodies of this ascomycete is actually in the soil, so they have to kind of dig them out. They're supposed to be really, really delicious. I think you could probably have an example and buy truffles and find out how they taste like if you go to fairly upscale restaurants. Okay, I think they're very expensive, very, very expensive. Okay. All right, and then so this is a product of yeast, which are, what is this anyway? A lot of college students are acquainted with this. This is beer, okay, different kinds of beers, right? Alrighty, and now the third group of fungi that we're going to talk about are in the division Basidiomycota. Okay, so you notice the zygomycetes are named after the fact that they have their spores produced in a zygospore. The ascomycetes got their name from their spores being produced in a structure known as an ascus. Okay, the division Basidiomycetes get their name from the fact that they get their spores from structures on mushrooms, bracket fungi, and puffballs. Okay, and those actually make something called basidia. Okay, so those are the structures that produce the spores in the Basidiomycetes. Isn't this beautiful? Yeah, so look, so the thing too, that even though the fungi definitely are, you know, studied by botanists, like a botanist called a mycologist, but still, they're not plants. You don't see any green in this here too, yeah? So these do not have chlorophyll. So they do get their nutrients from exuding digestive enzymes and absorbing food from their environments, okay? Excuse me. And here's another one. I think this is actually not an edible one. This might be the death angel, okay? All right. And here you see a Stilton cheese, okay? Of course, cheese is made from milk products, probably goat milk, sometimes, I mean, mostly cow's milk, also goat's milk, like that. You get all that great feta cheese and stuff. I really love cheese. I wish I didn't, but I do. But here you have all this nice fungal growth, right, that provides a veining in this kind of cheese. So blue cheeses, Stilton cheeses like that, all those really good, really cheeses that little kids don't like because they find it really stinky, you know. But these cheeses generally get their veining, which makes them so expensive, because any kind of product, any kind of food, or any kind of product that you make that you have to hold on to for a while, or that you have to treat with something, will cost you more than something that's, you know, that doesn't involve as much time factor or as much treatment. Okay, you know, like cottage cheese is not that expensive, but if you buy a nice blue cheese, boy, it's really expensive. Yeah. Anyway, so blue cheeses get their veining from members of the Basidiomycota that produce this kind of blue veins, these blue and greenish veining in the cheeses. Okay? Alrighty, so that kind of sums up the kingdom fungi for us. Now the last kingdom that we're going to talk about are the kingdom Plantae, of course. And the first group that we're going to talk about are in the division Bryophyta, okay, the bryophytes. Okay? And these are the mosses. Okay, here's a nice illustration here of all different kinds of mosses here, okay? And here you can see that you have these these structures that have leaf-like structures on them, okay? These are what we're going to call the gametophytes, because remember in the kingdom Plantae you also have an alternation of generation, where you have a gametophyte that produces the gametes, and you have the sporophyte that produces the spore, remember? The gametophyte being the plant that produces the gametes, the sporophyte, the plant that produces the spores. Okay, here you have this green part here. This represents the gametophyte of this particular moss. This part here that is colored brown in this photograph, okay, is the sporophyte, the part of the plant that produces the spores. We're going to go into alternation of generation a little bit at the beginning on this little survey of the plant kingdom, but we're not going to do the whole shmoo, okay? So here you can see this is actually one that produces the male structure here that produces a sperm. Okay, here this is a female structure that produces the egg. Well, the sperm then, needs water to swim in. A characteristic of the mosses, okay, and another couple of these divisions is that they tend to live in wet areas, okay, places where there's a lot of moisture, partly because the moss body here, the part that does the photosynthesis, doesn't have any vascular tissue. There's no xylem, no phloem in mosses. So they tend to be small because they get their water, to keep their cells turgid, they get it only through osmosis, where water actually moves from one cell to the next cell to the next cell. So usually mosses are very, very small plants. They're usually less than 2 inches tall, okay? And another thing too is because their sperm need to swim over to the female structure, their sperm are flagellated. Okay, they have flagella on the sperm of these, just like human sperm also have flagella on them too. Another thing, so you have the sperm swimming over to the female structure. Don't worry about antheridium and archegonium. Don't worry about that terminology. Just know the concept. Sperm swims, with the water that is present in the environment that the mosses grow in. They swim over, fertilize the egg in the female structure. Then the egg is diploid, right? This fertilization is where you have the haploid gametophyte, okay, producing the gametes, sperm and egg, and then you have the restoration of the diploid number. You have 2N zygote. The zygote germinates and then forms, it grows and forms a structure here, which is called the sporophyte. So the sporophyte is diploid, but in the capsule of the sporophyte you have meiosis happening, and also in this case you have the sporophyte being brown in color. Usually the sporophyte doesn't do photosynthesis. So in this case you have the gametophyte doing photosynthesis, supplying food to the sporophyte, okay? In the capsule of the sporophyte, you have meiosis going on, resulting in haploid spores, okay? These haploid spores will then germinate and form the body or the gametophyte, okay, the haploid gametophyte. Okay, so you have this structure here, the capsule, okay, calyptra, I guess they call it sometimes, right? Anyway, so here you have the capsule producing haploid spores through meiosis, the spores germinating, okay? So this is a plant, but this is a spore-bearing plant. It does sexual reproduction with spores, okay? So you have here the growing gametophyte here, okay, producing the gametophyte, and then in different parts of the gametophyte, you'll have the production of sperm and egg, okay? Sperm in the male structures, eggs in the female structures, and then the life cycle continues in that way. So you have an alternation of generation. You have the sporophyte producing haploid spores. You have the gametophytes, okay, the gamete-bearing plants producing the gametes, the sperm and the egg. After fertilization, you have the sporophyte developing from that, and it goes around and around. Alternation of generation, okay? And here we have mosses growing on a tree trunk here, growing on the non-living part of a tree known as the bark, all right? This is a nice photograph, yeah? And here we also have a photograph of mosses growing on a rock. So I bet you when you're kind of hiking or you're out walking someplace where there's mosses, I bet you didn't know that there's this high drama going on in these mosses, Fertilization, meiosis, fertilization, meiosis, yeah? Next group is in the division Hepatophyta. Okay, hepato, of course, refers to liver, and they're known as the liverworts. Okay, liverworts, they used to be thought to belong to the bryophytes, but in more modern classification schemes, they're actually in their own division. Okay, you can actually walk past mosses, walk past liverworts, and also later we're going to talk about hornworts. You might not even notice them because liverworts and hornworts, just like mosses, are very small plants. They don't have vascular tissue. Okay. So here you can see that they call it liverwort because people in olden days, in the 1400s and etc., used to think that it looked like a liver. And they also prescribed this for use in treatment of liver diseases, okay? The word wort, W-O-R-T, actually means plant. It means plant, I think, in Anglo-Saxon. So liverwort just means liver plant, okay? It's kind of a strange word, it looks like, but I guess we don't really speak Anglo-Saxon now, even though English is sort of derivative of Anglo-Saxon. Okay, so here you see the liverworts, all right? Next thing we're going to see that this is actually a thalloid liverwort that has the green part, the growing part in this thallus structure. And you also have leafy liverworts where you have like leaf forms, but these aren't really true leaves, just like on the mosses. Mosses don't have true leaves, but they do have leaf-like structures, okay? And here's a life cycle of a liverwort called Marcantia. All right, so here you have the female structure, the female gametophyte that will produce the egg. Okay, in these structures in here called, don't worry about what it's called. You have the male gametophyte producing a structure that will produce sperms in the male structure in here. Okay, this is a thalloid liverwort. So just remember, the female gametophyte of a Marcantia looks like a little coconut tree. Okay, it really does. It's kind of interesting. Okay, anyway, so the male will produce flagellated sperm. Here's a sperm with a flagella on them, and this too lives in wet places because the plant is very small. Also doesn't have vascular tissue. Also, it needs to have water so that the sperm can swim to the female structure. Okay, sperm fertilizes the egg. Okay, then you have the development of this thing here that looks like a little coconut on this little coconut tree. Okay, so you have the sporophyte growing on the female gametophyte. So in this case too, you have the sporophyte dependent for nutrition on the gametophyte. Anyway, so the spores will actually be a result from meiosis in the sporophyte. The spores are released, growing into new, gametophytes, and then the life cycle will continue. Another thing about these liverworts is they have these little structures known as gemmae, okay, G-E-M-M-A-E, which is plural for gemma, okay? So this is actually a way you actually have these little structures in there that are washed out by dripping water, and this is vegetative reproduction. It's like this little plant is cloning itself, okay? Vegetative or asexual reproduction. The next group are called the hornworts, okay, the Anthocerophyta, all right? Here's a nice picture. Here's a thalloid one. Here you can see this little structure here. Okay, this little structure actually is the structure that produces the spores. Okay, and they're called hornworts because this little structure here looks like a little horn, like a little unicorn horn. Okay, it too goes through an alternation of generation that is fairly similar to what we've seen before, with this being the horn structure. Okay, just like we saw in the liverworts. Okay, and then here's another hornwort here. Okay. The next group are in the division Xylophytes, and they're Xylophyta, and they're known as the whisk ferns. Okay, in Hawaii they're called moa. Okay, here's one. This is one that we've seen before, whisk fern. Okay, this is Xylotum nudum, and then this one here is Xylotum complanatum. And now, if we kind of look at this plant on the elmo here, okay, what we have here is a xylophyte, right? Xylophyte, Xylotum nudum. You can see here, this is still a spore-bearing plant. All the members of the plantee that we've seen so far do their sexual reproduction through spores. These little structures here are the sporangia that produce the spores. When they're mature, they're yellow. They also have a use in that Hawaiian men in the olden days, remember? Well, one of the things they used to wear was a malo. Yeah, it's like a loincloth. Well, they used to use the spores of this plant almost like a talcum powder to keep from getting chafed, from that stuff that's kind of, around them, the malo, right? So we use it like a chafing talcum powder for that use, okay? Okay, the next division we're going to do pretty fast here. Okay, the next division we're going to talk about are the lycophytes, or the Lycophyta. Okay, so they're also known as the club mosses. So this here is a plant, okay, that is actually bears spores as well. Okay, club mosses. Another group another kind of plant in here is called Selaginella. So they do bear their spores, okay, in sporangia. They don't actually make seeds. So everything we were talking about right now reproduce sexually through spores. Okay. Another thing about them, it's very dramatic, is that their spores have a lot of oil in them. Okay, so I know that some people who run botany labs, if they have a whole bunch of spores. When I was in school, there was a big bottle full of spores from these lycophytes, and I know some of the teaching assistants in their Botany 101 labs would actually put some of them in a glass, light it, and you'd have this huge explosion. And in fact, like in the 1800s when they had that flash photography, you had that little thing, like a little tray with that little trowel thing that they hold like this. They have the head underneath the black cloth. They say, hold it, and then they flash it. they actually use that flash powder from the spores of the lycophytes for that. It's kind of interesting. And I know too that I think that some of the teaching assistants, like I said, they actually did a demonstration of that in lab, you know, kind of exciting. For me, I was kind of chicken, you know, I don't like fire very much. It kind of scares me, so I didn't do it. But that was something, okay? Another group of plants in this, in the lycophytes is called quillworts. All right, and this is sort of how they look like. I guess the leaves kind of look like the quills of porcupine. Yeah. The next division we're going to look at are the sphenophytes, and they're also known as the horsetails. Okay. So what we'll have here on this overheads here is that you have the structure. So this actually does have true leaves, amazingly. It's not these things sticking out here on the side. These are actually stems, but you need to see these little brown things. They're like tiny little leaves. They're true leaves because they do have veins in them, okay? So from the xylophytes, you can see that the plant is a little bigger. Through to the lycophytes and into the sphenophytes, we have vascular tissues in these plants. They're bigger, right? Anyway, so here the sphenophytes are horsetails. Let's see, they're also known as scouring rushes because they have silica in their cell walls. So when, you know, those Conestoga wagons were kind of crossing the Great Plains, you know, during pioneering days on the United States, they'd actually grab a bunch of these plants and use them to scour pans with. They'll actually use them to kind of wash the pans because they do have hard substances, silica, in their cell walls. So these brown things here are actually the leaves of this plant. These green things here are actually the stems. And this here is showing the reproductive structure, which is a cone, a strobilus, okay? And this will produce spores. So here on the elmo, we have a little bit of a sphenophyte here. This is another equisetum, or scouring rush. And here you can see this is a reproductive structure, okay? We have this part here, okay, being the strobilus, or the cone, right? Anyway, so all these different plants, they really do go through alternation of generations, okay? The next group, the next division we're going to talk about are the pterophytes, also known as the ferns, all right? So here you have a nice depiction of some ferns, tree ferns sort of thing, okay? And here you have the, what do you call that? What they call the fiddlehead, characteristic of an unfurling fern leaf, okay? So fiddlehead is one characteristic of ferns, and it is very good to know. It's this characteristic of ferns, and only ferns. Another characteristic of fern is that if you look on the underside of the reproductive leaves, they bear spores, but they bear spores in structures called sori, okay? So, so here, okay, under the elmo, okay, we have here a close-up of some of these sori. All right, look at that. So they're actually little structures that actually bear spores on them. Okay, so this is the bottom or the underside of Lawae fern, right? Another thing is that here you have little fiddlehead. Okay, this one here, this is a little fiddlehead of the kupu-kupu fern. Got to go wide a little bit here. Yeah, little fiddlehead. Yeah, so these two characteristics are very characteristics of fern. Okay, of the division Pterophyta. This too goes through an alternation of generation, okay, as well. Now we're getting into the seed plants next. Okay, so all the different members of the kingdom Plantae generally don't have seeds. They do their reproduction through spores. Right, the first division we're going to look at. So at this division, these are gymnosperms. I mean, that's an artificial classification because they're actually in different divisions. The division Cycadophyta includes the cycads. Sometimes people call them sago palms, but they're not palms because palms are flowering plants. Okay. Another interesting thing about the cycads, so here you have a female plant here that has these seeds. Remember, gymnosperm means naked seed, right? In the olden Greek days, you had those guys wrestling and doing all these other things in the gymnasium where they were naked in the Greek days, okay? So gym means naked, and sperm refers to seed. So here we have a seed born nakedly on the female structures of a female plant. Here you have the male structure, a male cone on a male plant, which will give the pollen, all right? So cycads, okay? Male plants, female plants, okay? They are, what is it called? Dioecious, right? Two houses, male on one plant, female on another, okay? And this is showing a distribution of cycads, all right? Another interesting about cycads too is that Some people think that they might be responsible for some kinds of senile dementia because they say that they have symbiotic blue-green algae that live, or blue-green bacteria that live among their roots. And these blue-green bacteria make a toxin. Okay, that's translocated through the rest of the plant. There are bats that eat the seeds of this plant. And then you have people who eat the bats. So what can happen is maybe you can have amplification of the toxins. This is like a conjecture or hypothesis that I've heard of. So it could be blue-green bacteria in these cycads could be responsible for some forms of senile dementia. That's kind of interesting. The next division is called the ginkgo phyta. And you have the ginkgo. Okay, some people call it a living fossil. All right, very pretty. They have fan-shaped leaves. Okay, and here you can see some male structures that make pollen, and then here you have female that has the seeds. So these look like fruits, but they're not fruits, they're actually seeds. Okay, here we have a beautiful tree, and this is what it looks like in the fall time. The leaves turn golden because it is a tree of the temperate areas. I don't think it grows too well in Hawaii. It doesn't get cool enough here. You can see the maturing seeds and the leaves turning yellow here. And this is a dissected seed. Okay, so here you have the little baby plant. This part would be the root, this part would be the shoot, yeah, as it grows. This is a very good image. And here you have fossils. In fact, in the past, people thought that this was a plant that was extinct, okay, because generally they only had fossils. But here you can see they rediscovered it in China when they opened up China to the west. They discovered them growing in the temple garden. So here it was, what they called a living fossil. The next division is the coniferophyta. It includes the conifers, okay, like this nice pine, okay, and here you can see the pine needles are actually leaves, okay, and here are leaves of, I think this is in the Cuprous ACE, this is like a cypress type of conifer, okay, very common. Dominant plant in the coniferous forest of the northern arboreal or coniferous forest. Female cone that will have the seeds produced nakedly right out on the outside, male cone that will produce the pollen. The next division is kind of interesting. This is a catch-all, okay, for so-called gymnosperms, and we have the needlephytes, including Needham. We'll see this over at Foster Garden. Okay, so here we have the seeds, okay, born nakedly, okay, right on the plant itself. Okay, here's another needlephyte, and this is called ephedra, the source of ephedrine, right? Sudafed, which is used for cold. Well, ephedra now is banned. Wasn't that some kind of drugs that young people were taking? Yeah. Anyway, so ephedrine, right, is actually from this. They also call it Mormon tea. It's an interesting plant. Okay, and here's another shot of it with these seeds born nakedly. All right. The third kind of needlephyte is called Welwitschia. Okay, it's a very strange plant. It just has two leaves. It grows in the Namibian desert in Africa. It's like a relic for sure. Okay, another group. So the needlephytes don't really look very similar. They're not real similar at all. There's only 3 different groups in here, but still, I guess this is like a catch-all for plants that don't belong in other classifications. Okay, finally, we're getting into the flowering plants, the division Magnolia phyta. Okay, so these are the flowering plants. You remember that we have monocots and we have dicots. And here you have a little germinating monocot with 1 cotyledon. We have a little germinating dicot with 2 cotyledons. Okay, excuse me. So here we have koa. This is interesting. You have koa with their juvenile leaves. So the reason why they call koa haole is because it's a foreign plant, and the leaves look like the juvenile leaves of the koa tree. Okay, so here are the more mature leaves. These are phyllodes, which is like an expansion of the petiole. Okay, so what happens is the blade disappears on the mature leaves of this plant. Here's a little seedling koa, and look how big it can get. Okay, the Hawaiian people or Hawaiian men used to be able to make a single hull of a canoe from one tree trunk. I think this might be the only place in Polynesia that you could make a single canoe hull from one tree. It got to be really big. They say that there's no koa trees you can make a canoe hull from anymore in one piece. Okay, very big tree. And here's a flowering head, flowering inflorescence, and here are the fruit. Okay, of the koa. So you can see why they call koa haole, because the flowers look a little bit like the koa, and also the juvenile leaves, very similar. Okay, here's a Haleakala silver sword. Okay, here's a bunch of them growing all in this area here. Here's one with a big flowering inflorescence here. Okay, this is a monocarpic plant. That means when after it flowers, so it will actually grow from up to 15 years old, you know, like this. Then when it sends up its flowering stalk, it'll flower, form fruits, and then it'll die. Okay. Then here we have Ohia lehua. All right, here's a big ohia tree. You can see a little bit of its bark. This is why they call the tree fern the mother of the forest, because oftentimes ohia seeds will grow onto the stem or the trunk of the tree fern and then grow. So here's an ohia tree growing from on top and around a tree fern. Okay, two major plants of the Hawaiian forest, and there's a third too. Now here's a ohia flowers, orangey red. Here's one that are darker red, and here's one that are yellow. Okay, very varied. This is the third plant of the Hawaiian forest that there was a major one. Okay, this is actually the dryland one. This is sandalwood. Okay, here's some more sandalwood flowers. Okay, and here's a native lolu. Okay, the only native kind of palm that we have here. And here's close-ups of a pichardia. Okay. And in here we have a sea plant. This is actually a flowering plant that lives in the marine environment. This is what they call a seagrass, Halophila hawaiiana, right? It's a native endemic seagrass. And here we have orchids. Here's one species of orchid native to Hawaii, Anecticalis. Here's another one, Liparus. Okay, these are two orchids, and then this third one is rare and endangered. Alrighty, that's it for today. So to summarize, okay, we talked about classification schemes. We talked about a survey of organisms studied by botanists. We did this survey. Then they're all good. All plants are good. Alrighty, so that's all that we have for you today. Hope that you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed it myself. I really did, okay? And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.